History books love to tell us about the great empires, Rome's iron grip on the Mediterranean, Britain's sun that never set, the Ottomans' sprawling dominion stretching across continents. We're taught they fell to mighty foes or crumbled under their own weight. But what if the truth is far more surprising? What if the real threats came from within, from ordinary people who rose up in moments of defiance so powerful, they nearly brought these empires to their knees? These are the rebellions you've never heard of, the uprisings scrubbed from the record, the sparks of resistance that almost changed everything. Picture this, a Roman emperor, ruler of the known world, waking to news that an entire province has erupted in revolt, not by an invading army, but by farmers, slaves, and local leaders who have had enough. Or the British Empire at the height of its power, facing a coordinated rebellion across its colonies, one that threatened to unravel its global dominance decades before it finally did. These stories aren't just footnotes, they're proof that history isn't just shaped by kings and generals, but by the collective courage of those who refused to bow. So why don't we know their names? Why are their struggles buried beneath the grand narratives of conquest and glory? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. This is a journey into the shadows of history where the echoes of these near victories still whisper. We'll walk through the moments when empires held their breath, when the unthinkable almost happened, and ask what it means that these stories were forgotten. By the time we're done, you'll see these colossal powers not as unstoppable forces, but as fragile giants, one rebellion away from collapse. And you'll start to wonder, what other revolutions, what other near misses have been lost to time? That's the power of history. It's not just about what happened, but about what almost did. The Tang dynasty at its peak was a marvel, a glittering empire of poets and scholars, where trade routes stretched to Persia and beyond, and cities like Chang'an dazzled with wealth and culture. But beneath this golden surface, cracks were forming. The Emperor Xuanzong had grown distant from his duties, consumed by his love for a concubine named Yong Gaifai. Meanwhile, the empire's military had become dangerously decentralized, with regional governors like Anlushin commanding armies larger than the emperor's own. Anlushin wasn't just any general, a charismatic commander of mixed Turkic and Sogdian heritage. He had risen through the ranks by flattering the emperor and exploiting the court's growing corruption. By the year 755, he controlled nearly a third of the Tang's military forces, and then he struck, claiming the emperor's advisors were plotting against him, and Lushan declared his own rival dynasty, plunging China into a war so brutal it would last for 8 years. The rebellion was apocalyptic. Cities burned, famine spread, and millions perished. Some historians estimate the death toll reached 36 million, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The Tang managed to claw back victory, but at a horrific cost. The dynasty never regained its former glory, and the empire fractured into warlord states. What's astonishing is how little we hear about this catastrophe today. Perhaps because it wasn't a foreign invasion, but a self-inflicted wound, a revolt born from the empire's own excesses and blind spots. The Anlushin Rebellion wasn't just a military conflict. It was a warning about what happens when power grows unchecked, when loyalty is bought rather than earned, and when an empire forgets the people it's meant to protect. Rome didn't see it coming. For decades, Judea had been a simmering cauldron of resentment, heavy taxes, religious provocations, and the arrogance of Roman governors pushing the Jewish population to the brink. Then, in the year 66, it boiled over. A Roman official's theft from the temple treasury sparked riots, and soon full-scale rebellion erupted. This wasn't just another provincial uprising. It was a holy war fought with a ferocity that shocked even Rome's battle-hardened legions. The rebels seized Jerusalem, driving out the Roman garrison and minting their own coins, a bold declaration of independence. For 4 years, they held their ground against the mightiest empire on earth. The siege that followed was apocalyptic. Roman General Titus encircled the city with walls, starving its people into desperation. When the legions finally broke through, the carnage was unimaginable. The temple, the heart of Jewish faith, went up in flames. Historians claim over 1 million perished, with thousands more enslaved. But here's what's chilling. Rome almost lost. Had other provinces like Gaul or Egypt seized the moment to rebel, the empire could have unraveled. Instead, the revolt remained isolated, crushed by sheer brutality. Yet the cost was staggering. Rome spent vast resources suppressing Judea, resources it couldn't spare as later crises mounted, and the rebellion's legacy. Buried, Roman historians framed it as a minor disturbance, not the existential threat it truly was. The tragedy of the Great Jewish Revolt isn't just its violence, it's how close it came to rewriting history. It exposed Rome's weakness, its overstretched armies, its reliance on fear, and the quiet truth that empires aren't toppled by fate, but by the courage of those who dare to defy them. That's why this story matters, not as a footnote, but as a warning one that echoes through the centuries. While Rome was locked in its bloody struggle against Judea, a storm was brewing far to the north, one that would push the empire to the edge of collapse. The Batavi, a Germanic tribe from the swampy lowlands of what's now the Netherlands, had long been Rome's most trusted allies. For generations, they served as elite auxiliaries, the backbone of the empire's frontier armies. Their warriors were legendary skilled horsemen, fearless fighters, and masters of river warfare. But loyalty, as Rome would learn, has its limits. The year 69 was chaos incarnate. 4 emperors rose and fell in quick succession, each vying for power as the empire teetered on civil war. The Batavi saw their chance. Led by the charismatic Julius Civilis, a former Roman officer with a deep-seated grudge, they turned their swords against their former masters. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a calculated betrayal by Rome's own elite soldiers. Civilis knew the empire's tactics, its weaknesses, and he exploited them ruthlessly. The Batavi fought like no other foe Rome had faced. They used the land itself as a weapon, luring legions into flooded marshes where their heavy armor became a death sentence. They sabotaged supply lines, ambushed reinforcements, and even convinced other Germanic tribes to join their cause. At one point, they annihilated 2 entire Roman legions, sending shockwaves through the empire. The Rhine frontier, Rome's lifeline to the north, collapsed. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the Batavi might carve out their own kingdom from Rome's carcass. What makes this rebellion so revealing is how it exposed the empire's fatal flaw, its dependence on the very people it oppressed. The Batavi weren't conquered subjects, they were partners, warriors who'd fought for Rome's glory. But when promises were broken, when respect faded, those same warriors became the empire's executioners. The revolt was eventually crushed, but not before revealing a truth empires still ignore today. No power is invincible when those who uphold it decide enough is enough. The Batavi faded into history, their rebellion overshadowed by Rome's larger crises. But their story is a masterclass in how empires fall. Not just from external blows, but from the rebellion of those who know their secrets best. It's a lesson written in blood and betrayal, one that echoes wherever power takes loyalty for granted. Constantinople in the year 532 was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The city's obsession with chariot racing had divided its people into two rival factions, the Blues and the Greens, each with their own loyalties, their own gangs, and their own grudges. But on that January day, something unprecedented happened. These bitter enemies set aside their rivalry and turned their fury on the man they blamed for their suffering, Emperor Justinian. Taxes were crushing, corruption was rampant, and the people had reached their breaking point. What began as shouts of protest in the hippodrome soon became an inferno. The mob stormed the streets, burning government buildings, churches, even the city's grand cathedral, Hagia Sophia. Flames swallowed entire neighborhoods, and for 5 days, Constantinople wasn't Justinian's capital, it was a rebel stronghold. The rioters crowned a new emperor, a reluctant noble named Hypatius, and for a moment it seemed the Byzantine Empire itself might shatter. Justinian, hiding in his palace, prepared to flee. But then his wife Theodora spoke the words that changed history. "Royalty is a fine burial shroud," she told him. With that, the emperor chose to fight. His general, Belisarius, led loyal troops to the hippodrome, where 30,000 rioters were gathered. The gates were barred, and what followed wasn't a battle, it was slaughter. By the time the swords fell silent, the sands of the arena ran red. The Nika riots were over, but their lesson lingered. This wasn't just a riot, it was a warning. Empires don't fall only to foreign armies or economic collapse. Sometimes the greatest threat comes from the streets, from the people who have been pushed too far. What's chilling is how close it came to working. Had Justinian fled, had Hypatius held power, the Byzantine Empire might never have reclaimed its glory. No reconquest of Italy, no Hagia Sophia rebuilt, no Justinianic code to shape laws for centuries. All of it hinged on those 5 days of chaos. The Nika riots remind us that even the grandest empires are just one angry crowd away from ruin. And perhaps that's why this story faded, because those in power would rather we forget how fragile they truly are. The Han dynasty had ruled China for centuries, its emperors claiming the mandate of heaven, its scholars crafting laws and philosophies that shaped civilization. But by the year 184, that mandate was crumbling. Corruption bled the countryside dry, famine stalked the land, and in the shadows a movement was growing, one that would shake the empire to its core. It began with two brothers, Zhang Ju and Zhang Liang, faith healers who preached a simple message. The Han had lost heaven's favor, and a new era was coming. Their followers wore yellow scarves, symbols of the earth that would overthrow the Han's imperial blue. They called themselves the Way of Supreme Peace, but history remembers them by the color of their defiance, the yellow turbans. What made this rebellion so terrifying to the Han wasn't just its scale, though it spread like wildfire across 8 provinces, with armies swelling into the hundreds of thousands. It was the fervor behind it. These weren't just starving peasants with pitchforks, they were believers convinced their cause was divine. They practiced rituals, swore oaths, and fought with a zeal that made imperial troops falter. When the rebellion erupted, entire garrisons defected. Cities fell without a fight. For a moment, it seemed the Han might vanish beneath a tide of yellow. The empire struck back with brutal efficiency. Elite generals like Cao Cao and Liu Bei, names later immortalized in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, cut their teeth crushing the revolt. But victory came at a horrific cost. Millions died, not just in battle but from the famines and plagues that followed. The Han survived, but its foundations were shattered. Warlords filled the power vacuum, setting the stage for the Three Kingdoms period, one of China's most famous eras of chaos. So why does the Yellow Turban Rebellion fade into obscurity compared to the wars that followed? Because it was messy. It wasn't a clash of noble houses or a struggle between rival generals. It was the fury of the forgotten. a revolt that proved empires could be broken by the very people they'd ignored. The scholars who wrote history served those empires. They'd rather recount the battles of kings than the uprising that nearly made kings irrelevant. The Yellow Turbans didn't just fail, they were erased. But their legacy lingers. They showed how easily faith and desperation could ignite a fire no army could extinguish. And they left a warning, one that echoes through every empire. Ignore the people for too long, and even the color of the sky can change. Charlemagne's name echoes through history as the father of Europe, the king who united fractured kingdoms under Christian rule, whose reign marked the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. But few remember the blood it took to forge that legacy. For 33 years, his armies waged a war so relentless, so savage, it defies the polished image of medieval glory. The Saxon Wars weren't battles. They were a slow, grinding annihilation of a people who refused to kneel. The Saxons weren't some scattered tribe. They were a fierce confederation of warriors, farmers, and chieftains rooted in the dense forests of northern Europe. To them, Charlemagne wasn't a unifier, he was an invader demanding they abandon their gods, their customs, their very way of life, and so they fought. Not in pitched battles, but in ambushes and raids, melting into the wilderness after each strike. Every time Charlemagne thought he'd broken them, their defiance flared anew. His response was apocalyptic. When Saxon leader Widukind rallied his people in the year 782, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 prisoners in a single day, a massacre so shocking even his own chroniclers struggled to justify it. Villages were torched, crops destroyed, families marched into exile, but the Saxons kept rising. They'd vanish into the marshes, regroup, and strike again. Year after year, the war drained Charlemagne's treasury, his manpower, his patience. What's chilling isn't just the violence, it's how close the Saxons came to victory. Had their tribes united earlier, had Widukind's alliances held, Charlemagne's empire might have fractured before it began. Instead, the Saxons fell piece by piece, their resistance worn down by sheer attrition. By the year 804, the war was over. The Saxons were baptized, their lands carved into counties, their rebellion erased from the story, yet the cost reshaped Europe. Charlemagne's obsession with crushing the Saxons left his borders vulnerable, his armies exhausted. The very empire he built would later splinter under the weight of those same divisions. The Saxon Wars reveal a truth we rarely admit. Every golden age is built on someone's silence. We remember the crowns, the cathedrals, the grand treaties, not the voices drowned out by the march of conquest. The Saxons didn't just resist an empire, they exposed the price of making one. The jungles of the Maya world were once alive with bustling cities, towering pyramids, and thriving markets. A civilization so advanced it mapped the stars and mastered mathematics centuries before Europe. But by the 9th century, something extraordinary happened. The great city-states didn't just fade away, they exploded from within. This wasn't a slow decline or a mysterious vanishing. It was a revolution, a firestorm of rebellion that shattered the very foundations of Maya society. And yet, we rarely hear about it. For generations, archaeologists spun tales of drought, warfare, or environmental collapse to explain the Maya's downfall. But the ruins tell a different story. In places like Kapan and Tikal, temples bear deliberate scars, faces of kings chiseled away, altars smashed, monuments toppled. These weren't the acts of invaders. They were the fury of the people who'd built those cities, rising up against rulers who'd grown distant, corrupt, or cruel. Imagine laborers who'd hauled stones for palaces they'd never enter, farmers taxed into starvation while priests feasted, artisans whose work glorified kings but left them in poverty. The spark that lit the rebellion wasn't drought or war, it was injustice. What makes this uprising so startling is how systematic it was. Across the Maya world, city after city followed the same pattern. Elites dragged from their thrones, sacred spaces desecrated, the very symbols of divine kingship erased. In some places, like the city of Cancun, the violence was swift and brutal, royal families slaughtered in their own palaces. Elsewhere, power simply dissolved as people abandoned cities to return to simpler lives in the countryside. The Maya collapse wasn't an accident, it was a rejection. So why does the myth of a mysterious collapse persist? Because it's easier to blame the weather or vague decline than to confront the truth. Even the most glittering civilizations can crumble when those at the top forget who holds them up. The Maya Revolt forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when faith in rulers erodes, when the stories that bind a society together lose their power? The answers aren't buried in the jungle, they're etched into those broken monuments, a warning carved in stone. The Maya didn't vanish, they walked away. And in their defiance, they left a lesson every empire ignores until it's too late. No king, no god, no dynasty is immortal when the people decide enough is enough. That's the real mystery, not why the Maya fell, but why we're so reluctant to hear the story they left behind. South Carolina in the year 1739 was supposed to be a model of British colonial power, a land of sprawling plantations where wealth flowed from rice and indigo and where the brutal machinery of slavery ran with ruthless efficiency. But on the morning of September 9th, that illusion shattered. Near the Stono River, a group of enslaved men, many likely veterans of wars in West Africa, made a choice that would send tremors through the empire. They broke into a store, seized weapons, and turned their chains into a war cry. This wasn't a spontaneous riot. The Stono Rebellion was a meticulously planned march toward freedom. The rebels moved methodically, burning plantations, liberating the enslaved, and growing their ranks as they advanced toward Spanish Florida, where they knew freedom awaited. They carried banners, shouted slogans, and even drummed a direct challenge to the laws forbidding enslaved people from gathering or making music. For a brief, terrifying moment, it worked. The colonial militia, caught off guard, fled before them. What followed was a massacre. The rebellion was crushed within days, its leaders executed, their bodies left on display as a warning. But the panic it ignited never truly faded. Planters lived in dread of another uprising, passing draconian laws to tighten control. No more drums, no more gatherings, no more teaching the enslaved to read. The crackdown was so severe it warped South Carolina's society for generations. Yet the real shock isn't just the rebellion itself, it's how close it came to changing everything. Had the Stono rebels reached Florida, had their message spread to the Caribbean, where enslaved populations outnumbered whites 10-1, the British Empire might have faced a firestorm it couldn't contain. That's why this story was buried. Empires can survive defeats on distant battlefields, but they can't afford their most exploited people to believe rebellion is possible. The Stono Rebellion wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a crack in the foundation of an empire built on stolen lives. And like all cracks, the more you try to cover them up, the deeper they run. The East India Company ruled India with an iron grip, its armies staffed by Indian soldiers, sepoys who outnumbered British troops 10-1. These men were the backbone of imperial control, trained to fight for a foreign power that treated them as second class. Then, in 1857, a rumor spread like wildfire. The new rifle cartridges issued to the troops were greased with pig and cow fat, making them unclean for both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. It wasn't just about cartridges, it was the final insult in a century of humiliation, exploitation, and broken promises. The rebellion erupted in Meerut on May 10th, when sepoys refused the cartridges and were shackled in front of their comrade. By nightfall, the garrison had risen, British officers lay dead, and the revolt surged toward Delhi. There, the rebels crowned the aging Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as their symbolic leader, a direct challenge to British authority. Within weeks, the uprising spread like a brushfire across northern India. Entire regiments defected, civilians joined the fight, and British families fled in panic. For a few terrifying months, it seemed the sun might finally set on the empire's most prized colony. What's staggering is how close they came. Had Delhi fallen sooner, had rebel factions united instead of fracturing, history might remember 1857 not as a rebellion but as India's war of independence. Key cities like Lucknow and Kanpur became sieges of unimaginable brutality. British forces clung to fortified residences, starving and outnumbered, while rebels bombarded them. Yet the British held on, bolstered by fresh troops and devastating reprisals. Villages were burned, prisoners executed en masse, and suspected rebels strapped to cannons and blown apart, a tactic designed to terrorize. The aftermath was even darker. The British dismantled the East India Company, replacing it with direct crown rule, but the real shift was psychological. The empire could never again pretend its hold on India was secure or benevolent, so they rewrote the story. Official reports dismissed the uprising as a mere mutiny, downplaying its scale and popular support. Rebel leaders were painted as fanatics, their grievances erased. The truth was too dangerous. If millions could rise once, they might rise again. The rebellion's legacy is a paradox. It failed militarily, but it planted an unshakable idea. Empire was not invincible. Future revolutionaries, from Gandhi to Bhagat Singh, would draw inspiration from those who dared to strike first. The British spent decades fearing another 1857, tightening control while pretending it had never truly threatened them. That's the irony of empire. The more desperately it clings to power, the more it betrays its own fragility. The rebels of 1857 didn't just fight for India. They exposed the lie that some nations are born to rule and others to obey, and that's a story no empire once told. The Haitian Revolution didn't begin with a manifesto or a grand speech. It began in the dark, under the cover of a tropical storm. On the night of August 21st, 1791, enslaved men and women gathered in the forests of Saint-Domingue, France's richest colony, where sugar and coffee plantations fueled Europe's economy. They didn't just want freedom, they planned to burn the entire system to the ground. By dawn, plantations were in flames, and the bloodiest slave revolt in history was underway. What followed wasn't just a rebellion, it was a reckoning. France's response was swift and brutal. They sent thousands of troops, including Napoleon's elite veterans fresh from conquering Europe. But the rebels, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, a formerly enslaved coachman turned military genius, fought with something the French couldn't match: desperation and brilliance. They turned the island's jungles into death traps, waged guerrilla warfare, and even outmaneuvered the British and Spanish armies that tried to exploit the chaos. By 1804, against all odds, Haiti became the first Black republic in history, the only nation born from a successful slave revolt. The world's empires reacted with horror. Slaveholding powers Britain, Spain, even the young United States refused to recognize Haiti, fearing its very existence would inspire their own enslaved populations. France, humiliated, demanded crippling reparations, forcing Haiti to pay for its own freedom under threat of invasion. The economic strangulation that followed was deliberate, a punishment for daring to win. Yet the real crime is how this triumph was erased. Textbooks reduced the revolution to a footnote, framing it as a chaotic bloodbath rather than a strategic masterpiece. The truth, Haiti's victory exposed the lie at the heart of empire, that some people are meant to rule and others to be ruled. That's why this story was buried. Because when the oppressed rise and win, it doesn't just change history, it changes what's possible, and that's a truth no empire once whispered. The Seleucid Empire was at the height of its power, its armies dominating the eastern Mediterranean, its Greek culture spreading from Syria to the borders of India. To its rulers, the Jewish people were just another subject population to be molded into their vision of a unified empire. But in the year 167 BC, Antiochus IV made a fatal miscalculation. He didn't just demand taxes or loyalty. He demanded the surrender of a people's soul. The decree was unthinkable. Jewish rituals outlawed, the Sabbath banned, the temple in Jerusalem defiled with pagan sacrifices. Torah scrolls were burned, circumcision became a death sentence, and those who refused to eat pork were tortured. This wasn't just oppression, it was cultural annihilation. Most empires would have expected surrender. Instead, they got fire. In the hills of Judea, a priest named Mattathias and his 5 sons turned their grief into defiance. When a Seleucid official ordered them to make a pagan offering, they slaughtered him and fled into the wilderness. What followed wasn't a conventional war, it was a rebellion of faith. The Maccabees, as they came to be called, fought like shadows, striking supply lines, ambushing patrols, and vanishing into the terrain they knew by heart. They weren't just warriors, they were symbols. Every raid proved that the empire's grip wasn't iron, it was brittle. The Seleucids, masters of open battle, were helpless against this kind of fight. Their heavy phalanxes meant nothing in the rocky hills. Their mercenaries had no stake in the conflict, and with every passing month, more Jews flocked to the Maccabees' banner, not just for freedom, but for the right to be who they were. By the year 164, the impossible happened. Jerusalem was retaken, the temple purified, and the menorah's oil, legend says, burned for 8 days on a single day's supply. Hanukkah was born from this moment, not just as a celebration of light, but as a testament to resilience. The real shock wasn't the Maccabees' victory, it was the empire's blindness. The Seleucids had assumed faith could be crushed like any other rebellion. They didn't understand that when you outlaw a people's identity, you don't erase it. You arm it. The Maccabean Revolt wasn't just a military defeat for the empire, it was a revelation. Culture isn't conquered by swords, it's carried in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Centuries later, empires still repeat Antiochus' mistake, underestimating the power of belief, the fury of those told to abandon who they are. The Maccabees didn't just win a war. They proved that the strongest walls aren't made of stone, but of memory, and that's a lesson no conqueror ever seems to learn. China in the mid-19th century was a tinderbox waiting to ignite. The Qing dynasty, once mighty, was buckling under foreign invasions, corruption, and a population stretched to its limits. Then came Hong Xiuquan, a failed civil service exam candidate who had a vision, or perhaps a delusion, that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to cleanse China and establish a heavenly kingdom on earth. What followed wasn't just a rebellion. It was a holy war, a social revolution, and a bloodbath so vast it dwarfed the carnage of the American Civil War and Napoleonic Wars combined. The Taiping Rebellion began quietly in the rural hills of Guangxi, where Hong's message of shared land, equality between men and women, and the overthrow of the king resonated with peasants crushed by taxes and famine. But within months, this ragtag movement became an army. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom marched north, capturing city after city, their ranks swelling with the desperate and disillusioned. By 1853, they seized Nanjing, turning it into their capital, a theocratic state where opium, gambling, and even foot binding were banned. For a moment, it seemed China might be remade in their image. What's staggering isn't just the scale of the conflict, 20 to 30 million dead, entire provinces depopulated, but how close the Taiping came to victory. Had they secured Shanghai earlier, had their internal divisions not splintered their leadership, the king might have fallen. Instead, the empire struck back with foreign help. British and French forces, initially neutral, eventually sided with the king, supplying modern weapons and even leading mercenary armies like the ever-victorious army under figures like Frederick Townsend Ward and Charles Gordon. The irony was brutal. Western powers who'd spent decades carving up China now propped up the very dynasty they'd weakened, fearing a Taiping victory would destabilize their trade. The rebellion's suppression was apocalyptic. Nanjing fell in 1864 after a siege so desperate that Hong Xiuquan's followers ate grass before resorting to cannibalism. The victors executed tens of thousands, erasing the Taiping from official records as mere bandits, but the scars never healed. The king, though victorious, were exposed as hollow, dependent on foreign aid to survive. Within 50 years, they too would collapse. So why is this cataclysm relegated to footnotes in Western histories? Because it contradicts the myth of imperial invincibility. It reveals how easily a single spark of dissent can become an inferno, how empires cling to power by the thinnest threads, and how often outsiders play both arsonist and firefighter. The Taiping Rebellion wasn't just China's tragedy, it was a warning, one that every empire then and now pretends not to hear. The year 1715 was supposed to be the end of an era. The Stuart dynasty, once rulers of England and Scotland, had been exiled for decades after the Glorious Revolution, but in the misty highlands of Scotland, loyalty to the old kings never died. When James Stuart, the Old Pretender, raised his standard that autumn, clansmen who'd spent a generation under Hanoverian rule saw their chance. They called it the 15, the First Jacobite Rising, a rebellion to tear Britain apart before its empire even took shape. What's startling isn't just that the Highlanders marched south, it's how far they got. With minimal supplies and no formal training, these clansmen shattered government forces at the Battle of Sheriffmuir, leaving the road to London eerily open. Panic gripped England, banks collapsed, towns fortified their gates, and whispers spread that the French might invade to support the Stuarts. For a moment, the British state teetered. Then hesitation. James arrived too late, his allies fractured, and the rebellion sputtered out. But the lesson was clear: this empire was built on sand. 30 years later, the Jacobites struck again, this time led by James's charismatic son, Bonnie Prince Charlie. The 45 was even more audacious. With just 5,000 men, the prince marched deep into England, capturing Edinburgh and reaching Derby, a mere 125 miles from London. The capital erupted in chaos. King George II packed his bags, while ministers debated fleeing to the colonies. France hesitated to send troops, and the Jacobites, outnumbered and outgunned, turned back. Their retreat to Scotland ended in the slaughter of Culloden Moor, the last pitched battle on British soil. Why does this matter? Because the Jacobites weren't just rebels, they were an existential threat. Had France intervened, had English Jacobites risen in support, Britain's rise as a global power might have been strangled in its cradle. No dominant navy, no industrial revolution, no empire on which the sun never set. Instead, the rebellion's failure allowed Britain to consolidate crushing Highland culture with brutal clearances, dismantling clans, and rewriting history to paint the Stuarts as doomed romantics rather than near victors. The real tragedy of the Jacobite Risings isn't their failure, it's how thoroughly they were erased. the British state couldn't afford to admit how close it came to collapse. So the story became a footnote, a romantic tale of kilts and lost causes, instead of what it truly was, a civil war that almost changed everything. The Highlands were silenced, but their defiance lingers in the cracks of history, proof that even the mightiest empires are just one rebellion away from oblivion. Rome never saw it coming. The Balkans had been conquered decades earlier, their tribes seemingly pacified, their warriors absorbed into Rome's auxiliary forces. But in the year 6 AD, the illusion of control shattered. The Great Illyrian Revolt wasn't just another provincial uprising. It was a firestorm that engulfed the entire Western Balkans, from modern-day Slovenia to Albania. And what made it so terrifying wasn't just the scale of the rebellion, but who was leading it. These weren't untrained peasants. They were Rome's own soldiers, men who'd been trained to fight in the empire's legions, only to turn their swords against their former masters. The spark came when Rome announced yet another draft, demanding more Balkan youths for its endless wars in Germania, but the people had reached their breaking point. Years of heavy taxes, corrupt officials, and the arrogance of Roman governors had turned loyalty into rage. Led by a chieftain named Botto, the rebels struck with precision, cutting off Roman supply lines, ambushing patrols, and seizing key fortresses. Within weeks, they controlled the entire Adriatic coast, threatening to split the empire in two. Emperor Augustus, who'd spent decades boasting of Rome's invincibility, faced a nightmare. The rebellion required 15 legions, a third of Rome's entire military, to suppress. For 3 brutal years, the war raged across mountains and forests, a grinding campaign of attrition where victories were Pyrrhic and defeats catastrophic. Roman generals resorted to scorched earth tactics, burning villages and slaughtering civilians to break the rebels' will. Even then, the Illyrians refused to surrender. What's chilling is how close they came to victory. Had the rebels coordinated with Germanic tribes revolting across the Rhine, or if Rome's legions had been stretched any thinner, the empire might have fractured permanently. Instead, the revolt was crushed through sheer exhaustion. Botto was captured, his followers dispersed, and the Balkans were left a smoldering ruin, but the damage was done. The war drained Rome's treasury, exposed its overstretched borders, and revealed a truth empires always ignore. No conquest is permanent if the conquered refuse to stay conquered. The Illyrian Revolt didn't just weaken Rome, it foreshadowed the empire's slow unraveling, because rebellions aren't just about battles, they're about the moment people realize their chains are lighter than they thought. And once that idea takes hold, no army can unthink it. For 82 years, the Spanish Empire had ruled over the pueblos of New Mexico with an iron fist, missionaries destroying sacred Cachina dolls, soldiers enforcing brutal labor demands, entire villages decimated by disease and punishment. Then, in the summer of 1680, a message traveled across the desert, passed through runners carrying knotted cords, each knot marking a day until the reckoning. When the final knot was untied, the Pueblo people rose as one. This wasn't a scattered uprising. It was a meticulously coordinated revolt, planned in secret by a visionary leader named Pepe. Warriors from dozens of villages struck simultaneously, burning missions, cutting water supplies, and slaughtering Spanish settlers who'd grown fat on their suffering. Within weeks, Santa Fe fell. Survivors fled south, leaving behind everything: homes, churches, even livestock. For the first time in living memory, the land belonged to its original people again. What's astonishing isn't just the revolt's success, it's how long it lasted. 12 years. 12 years without Spanish taxes, without forced baptisms, without priests ripping children from their families. The Pueblos tore down mission altars and restored their kivas, planting crops in harmony with ancestral cycles rather than colonial greed. Spain, the mightiest empire on earth, had been humbled by those they'd called savages. But history has a way of burying what empires can't explain. When the Spanish returned in 1692, they didn't come with apologies or reflection, they came with fire and sword. They rebuilt Santa Fe, scrubbed Pompey's name from records, and pretended the revolt was a fleeting outburst rather than a sustained rebirth of Pueblo sovereignty. The archives barely mention it, textbooks reduced it to a footnote, yet the truth lingers in the whispers of Pueblo elders, in the resilience of traditions that survived every attempt to erase them. The revolt proved something empires still fear, that no oppression lasts forever, that even the most broken chains can be reforged into weapons. Spain couldn't admit how close they'd come to losing the Southwest forever. So they buried the story, hoping the desert wind would scatter it like sand. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some victories, however brief, echo across centuries. The marshes of southern Iraq were supposed to be the empire's graveyard, a watery labyrinth where the Abbasid Caliphate sent its most disposable workers, East African slaves known as the Zanj. Forced to labor waist-deep in salt flats, draining swamps under the scorching sun, their lives were short, brutal, and forgotten, until one man turned their despair into a weapon. His name was Ali ibn Muhammad, a mysterious preacher who promised not just freedom but vengeance. What began in 869 as isolated riots exploded into the most terrifying slave revolt the Islamic world had ever seen. The Zanj weren't just rebelling, they were building a state. From their hidden strongholds in the marshes, they launched raids with terrifying efficiency, capturing towns, seizing weapons, and even minting their own coins. At their peak, they controlled southern Iraq's critical trade routes, choking off the Abbasids' wealth and food supplies. The Caliphate's response was panic. They threw army after army into the swamps, only to watch them vanish into the reeds, ambushed by fighters who knew every inch of the terrain. The rebellion's longevity is what shocks most. 14 years of battles, sieges, and near misses that brought one of history's most powerful empires to its knees. The Zanj sacked Basra, Islam's richest port, leaving it in ruins. They outmaneuvered elite commanders who'd fought Byzantines and Turks, proving that tactical genius wasn't bred in palaces, it was forged in suffering. But the real lesson lies in why the revolt came so close to succeeding. The Abbasid economy relied on enslaved labor for everything from agriculture to infrastructure. The Zanj didn't just attack soldiers, they attacked the empire's invisible foundation. Every plantation burned, every canal sabotaged, was a blow to the illusion that power flowed downward from the caliph. It flowed upward from the hands of those who built it. When the rebellion finally fell in 883, the Abbasids erased it from their chronicles, reducing it to a bandit uprising. Yet the scars never faded. The caliphate never fully regained its strength, and within centuries it collapsed entirely. The Zange Rebellion wasn't just a fight for freedom, it was a preview. A glimpse of what happens when the people who hold up an empire decide to let go. And that's a story no ruler, ancient or modern, once told. Rome's conquest of Sicily should have been a triumph, a lush island transformed into the empire's breadbasket, its fertile fields worked by endless chains of enslaved laborers. But by the year 135 BC, those same fields became the stage for one of history's most shocking rebellions. This wasn't a scattered protest. It was a full-blown slave army, led by a man named Yunus, a former mystic who'd been forced into the mines before his rage ignited a revolution. His followers didn't just demand freedom, they carved out their own kingdom, defying Rome for 4 bloody years. What made the First Servile War so terrifying to Rome wasn't just the scale, though at its peak, Eunice commanded over 70,000 fighters, outmaneuvering legion after legion. It was the symbolism. These weren't foreign warriors. They were the empire's invisible hands, the people who harvested its grain, built its roads, and now turned its own tools against it. Eunice crowned himself king, minted coins bearing his likeness, and even staged mock Roman trials, forcing captured slave owners to fight as gladiators for his amusement. The rebellion only collapsed when Rome threw everything it had at Sicily, besieging the rebel stronghold of Enna until starvation did what swords could not. But here's the twist: Rome didn't learn. 30 years later, another slave leader, Salvius, repeated history, seizing entire cities, training his forces in Roman tactics, and even creating a cavalry unit from stolen horses. The Second Servile War proved oppression wasn't a mistake, it was a system, and systems, when pushed too far, create their own destroyers, the real tragedy. These revolts weren't isolated. They were rehearsals for Spartacus's legendary uprising decades later, a near-fatal blow that would shake Rome to its core. Yet empires never seemed to grasp the lesson. Chains might bind bodies, but they forge unbreakable resolve. Sicily's rebellions didn't just fail, they became blueprints, proving that no empire, no matter how mighty, is safe from those it refuses to see as human. And that's a truth written not in Rome's marble monuments, but in the ashes of the plantations it couldn't hold. The Russian Revolution promised liberation, but for the Muslims of Central Asia, it delivered only another master. By 1918, the Bolsheviks had seized power, declaring a new world order, yet in the deserts and mountains of Turkestan, a different revolution was brewing. The Basmati movement wasn't just a rebellion, it was a clash of worlds, a desperate fight by nomadic horsemen, farmers, and clerics to reclaim their land from an empire that had simply swapped its crown for a red star. At first, the Basmati, a term the Soviets sneered, meaning bandits, were scattered bands, angry over land seizures and the forced conscription of their sons into a war they didn't believe in. But when Moscow demanded cotton harvests at gunpoint, starving entire villages to feed its industrial machine, resistance became survival. The movement swelled into an army, uniting Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Turkmen under warlords like Enver Pasha, the Ottoman general who saw this as a holy war. They knew the terrain like the lines on their hands, vanishing into the Pamir Mountains or the Kizilkum Desert after striking Soviet outposts. For years, they controlled vast swaths of the Fergana Valley, cutting rail lines and leaving Red Army garrisons isolated. What's staggering isn't just their defiance, it's how close they came to winning. By 1921, the Basmati held half of modern-day Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Soviet troops, demoralized and overstretched, deserted in droves. Moscow's grip on Central Asia hung by a thread. Then came Stalin's answer, not just bullets but famine. When military campaigns failed, the Soviets burned crops, poisoned wells, and herded nomads into collective farms at gunpoint. Starvation did what rifles couldn't. By the 30s, the rebellion was crushed, its leaders executed or exiled, its very name scrubbed from Soviet textbooks. Yet the Basmati's legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Their tactics, hit-and-run raids blending into civilian populations, would later inspire Afghan Mujahideen fighting the Soviets in the 80s. Their dream of independence, though buried, never died. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, it was those same Central Asian republics, once battlegrounds of the Basmati, that walked away without looking back. The revolt wasn't just a footnote, it was a prophecy. Empires can rewrite history, but they can't erase the truth. No rule lasts forever when the people decide they'd rather die on their feet than kneel. And that's a lesson written not in Moscow's archives, but in the wind-swept valleys where the Basmati once rode free. By the dawn of the 20th century, China was a carcass being picked apart by vultures. Foreign powers had carved the empire into spheres of influence, British merchants flooding the country with opium, German soldiers patrolling Shandong, French priests converting villages by force. The Qing dynasty, once the celestial rulers of the Middle Kingdom, stood by helpless as treaties stripped away sovereignty mile by mile. Then, from the drought-stricken fields of northern China, an answer came. Not from scholars or generals, but from farmers who called themselves the righteous and harmonious fists. To foreigners, they were the Boxers, and in the summer of 1900, they turned Beijing into a war zone. What began as local skirmishes against Christian missionaries exploded into a nationwide uprising. The Boxers weren't just angry, they believed they were invincible. Their rituals promised immunity to bullets, their banners declared divine protection. When the king court, torn between crushing the rebellion and harnessing its fury, finally sided with the Boxers, the streets of the capital ran with blood. Foreign legations found themselves under siege, their walls pounded by homemade cannons, their diplomats trapped for 55 days with dwindling food and water. For the first time in living memory, the representatives of 8 empires, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and more huddled behind barricades, fearing the mob outside would slaughter them all. The international response was apocalyptic. A 20,000-strong alliance of troops, including American Marines and Russian Cossacks, marched on Beijing. They broke the siege, but the carnage didn't stop there. Villages suspected of harboring Boxers were burned. Looters ransacked the Forbidden City. The King-Empress Dowager, who'd secretly encouraged the rebellion, fled in a peasant cart disguised as a servant. The aftermath was humiliation incarnate. Crippling reparations, foreign armies garrisoned permanently on Chinese soil, and the final unraveling of imperial authority. Yet the Boxer Rebellion's legacy is a paradox. In the West, it's often remembered as a fanatical bloodbath proof of China's backwardness. But peel back the layers, and you'll find something far more profound. A people pushed to the brink, lashing out at every symbol of their subjugation. The Boxers weren't just attacking foreigners, they were attacking the very idea that their land could be dismembered without consequence. Their methods were brutal, their beliefs often mystical, but their rage was rooted in something undeniable, the refusal to disappear quietly. That's why this rebellion still haunts modern China. It's celebrated as anti-colonial resistance and condemned as reckless violence, sometimes in the same breath. Because the Boxers laid bare an uncomfortable truth: when empires push too hard, even the weakest fists can shake the world. And sometimes the only thing more dangerous than losing a rebellion is winning the war that follows. The Spanish-American War ended in 1898 with America the unexpected owner of the Philippines, a sprawling archipelago it had no idea how to govern. While U.S. textbooks focus on Teddy Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill, they rarely mention what came next: 14 years of brutal warfare against Muslim Filipinos in the southern islands, a conflict so savage it would leave scars still felt today. This wasn't just a war, it was America's first taste of guerrilla warfare in Asia, a bloody preview of Vietnam half a century early, and a rebellion Washington would later pretend never happened. The Moro people of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago had resisted Spanish rule for centuries, preserving their Islamic faith and warrior traditions. When American troops arrived, waving flags and promising benevolent assimilation, the Moro saw no difference between one colonial master and another. Their resistance began almost immediately. Led by charismatic datus and imams, Moro fighters wielded razor-sharp kris swords and fought with a ferocity that stunned you. Soldiers, these weren't conventional battles, they were ambushes in dense jungles, midnight raids on remote outposts, and acts of defiance so bold they became legend. One Moro warrior, Datu Amil, reportedly charged a fortified American position alone, killing 4 soldiers before falling in a hail of bullets. America's response was a masterclass in imperial brutality. General John J. Pershing, later famous for leading U.S. forces in World War I, earned his stripes here, experimenting with tactics that would become grimly familiar in later conflicts. When Moro fighters, believing their anting amulets made them bulletproof, launched suicidal charges, Pershing ordered his men to switch from rifles to shotguns for maximum carnage. In 1913, the U.S. military faced its most infamous atrocity, the Bud Dojo massacre, where 600 Moro men, women, and children were slaughtered in a volcanic crater after refusing to surrender. One officer described the scene as more like a butcher shop than a battlefield. What makes this rebellion so haunting isn't just the violence, it's the erasure. While the U.S. celebrated victories in Cuba and the Philippines' Christian North, the Moro War was swept into history's shadows. No parades, no medals, just silent cables between generals discussing the Mohammedan problem. The conflict officially ended in 1913, but the resentment never faded. Today, Mindanao remains a tinderbox of separatist movements, a living reminder that empires don't get to decide when rebellions are truly over. The Moro Rebellion forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How does a nation founded on revolution become an empire crushing rebellions? Why do some wars get remembered while others vanish? And perhaps most chillingly, how many other Bud Dojos are buried in the footnotes of history, waiting to be uncovered? The answers aren't in the textbooks. They're in the stories we've been taught not to tell. East Africa in 1905 was supposed to be a triumph of German colonialism, lush plantations of cotton and rubber stretching across what's now Tanzania, built on the backs of forced labor. But that year, something extraordinary happened. A spiritual leader named Kinjekit Al Ngwale began preaching a revelation. Water mixed with sacred millet could turn German bullets into rain. They called it Maji Maji, sacred water, and with that promise, tribes who'd never before united, the Ngoni, the Yao, the Motambai, took up spears and marched against their oppressors. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a revolution of faith. Villages burned their tax receipts, severed ties with colonial collaborators, and launched coordinated attacks on German outposts. For the first time, ethnic divisions melted away, replaced by a shared dream of liberation. And for a moment, it worked. German forces, caught off guard by the scale of the uprising, fell back in disarray. But empires don't surrender easily. Berlin's response was methodical annihilation. General Lothar von Trotha, fresh from orchestrating the hero genocide in Namibia, ordered a scorched earth campaign. Crops were torched, villages razed, and waterways poisoned. Starvation became a weapon. One German officer's diary chillingly noted, "The land is now a desert. We have killed not just warriors, but the future itself." By the time the rebellion was crushed in 1907, nearly 300,000 people were dead. Whole regions stood empty, their stories erased beneath the silence of colonial archives. What's most haunting isn't the violence, it's the forgetting. Germany never tried the perpetrators. No reparations were paid, no monuments erected to the dead. The Magi-Maggi Rebellion vanished from textbooks, reduced to a footnote in Europe's civilizing mission. Even today, while Germany confronts its Nazi past, Its colonial atrocities remain shrouded in silence, but the rebellion's legacy lingers in whispers. It proved that spiritual resistance could bind fractured peoples together, a lesson later anti-colonial movements would borrow, and it exposed the lie at the heart of empire that some lives matter so little, their erasure doesn't even warrant an apology. The Magi may not have stopped bullets, but it did something far more dangerous. It made the invisible seen, if only for a moment, and that's a memory no amount of fire can erase. The British Empire in India was built on controlled, tightly rationed trust, carefully calculated force, and the unshakable belief that their rule was as inevitable as the monsoon rains. But in the sweltering spring of 1857, that control began to slip. Whispers spread through army barracks and bazaars. A conspiracy was brewing, a synchronized uprising that would see every sepoy, every Indian soldier in British service, turn their rifles on their officers in a single bloody night. The date was said to be May 31st. The result would be catastrophe. The British response was swift and merciless. Officers who'd spent years dining with their sepoy subordinates now eyed them like coiled snakes. Entire regiments were disarmed overnight. Suspects were dragged into courtyards and hanged without trial. In Benares, a young sepoy named Mangal Pandey became the rebellion's unwilling martyr when his drunken rage at a British lieutenant spiraled into a firefight. An isolated incident spun into proof of the coming storm. By the time the calendar reached May 31st, the air was thick with dread, and then nothing. No mass mutiny, no coordinated revolt, just the eerie silence of a rebellion that never materialized. What's revealing isn't the absence of violence, it's the violence of absence. The British hadn't crushed a rebellion, they'd invented one. Their paranoia revealed a truth empires hate to admit. Fear is often more dangerous than the threat itself. The crackdown backfired spectacularly. Sepoys who might have remained loyal now questioned why they should serve masters who trusted them so little. Families of the executed seethed in silence. The very rumors Britain had feared became a self-fulfilling prophecy, planting seeds of resentment that would blossom into the real uprising months later. The one history remembers as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. This phantom conspiracy exposes the fragility of imperial power. Empires don't just fear armies, they fear ideas the moment their subjects realize their strength is borrowed, their authority a mirage. The British didn't just overreact in 1857. They showed their hand, proving that beneath the polished boots and polished lies, they were always one spark away from panic. And sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't the one fought on battlefields, but the one waged in the minds of those who have learned to stop believing in their master's invincibility. The winds sweeping across the Great Plains in 1890 carried more than dust, they carried a prophecy. Among the Lakota, a Paiute holy man named Wovoka spoke of a vision where the buffalo returned. The ancestors rose from the earth, and the white settlers vanished like mist. His message spread like wildfire, igniting a movement called the Ghost Dance. Followers wore sacred shirts they believed could stop bullets, their feet moving in rhythmic circles as they chanted for the world to be made new. To the U.S. government, it looked like rebellion. To the Lakota, it was the last desperate prayer of a people pushed to the edge of existence. What happened next wasn't just a massacre, it was a betrayal wrapped in bureaucracy. The U.S. Army, already on edge from the Lakota's refusal to surrender their lands under broken treaties, saw the Ghost Dance as a prelude to war. When officials demanded the arrest of Sitting Bull, the legendary leader who'd become a symbol of resistance, the confrontation turned deadly. His death sent shockwaves through the Lakota camps, driving hundreds to flee toward the Badlands for safety. Among them were the families of Chief Bigfoot, weakened by winter and hunger, their only crime wearing the Ghost Dance shirts they hoped would protect them. The 7th Cavalry intercepted them at Wounded Knee Creek on December 29th. What began as a disarmament turned into horror when a single shot, no one knows from which side, unleashed a storm of rifle fire and cannon blast. Women and children running for cover were cut down. The wounded were left to freeze in the snow. By the time the guns fell silent, nearly 300 Lakota lay dead, their bodies dumped in a mass grave. The army handed out medals for valor to the soldiers who'd carried out the slaughter. But here's what history often misses. Wounded Knee wasn't just the end of native resistance. It was the beginning of a cover-up. Newspapers framed it as a battle. Survivors were silenced, and the ghost dance was dismissed as primitive fanaticism rather than the profound spiritual movement it truly was. The government banned the dance, fearing its power to unite tribes. Photographs of the massacre were buried in archives, only to resurface decades later as evidence of what had been done. The tragedy of Wounded Knee isn't just the lives lost, it's the stories stolen. The ghost dance wasn't a threat, it was a lament, a final act of faith in a world where justice seemed impossible. And in that way, it succeeded. The dance was outlawed, but its spirit couldn't be killed. A century later, in 1973, Lakota activists would reclaim Wounded Knee during the American Indian Movement standoff, proving that resistance, like the ghost dance itself, was never truly gone, just waiting for the right moment to rise again. Some wounds never heal, some dances never end, and some truths, no matter how buried, refuse to stay silent. Kenya in the 1950s was supposed to be the jewel of British East Africa, a land of sprawling tea plantations and loyal subjects. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. The Kikuyu people, stripped of their ancestral lands and forced into labor under colonial rule, had reached a breaking point. When whispers of the Mau Mau movement began circulating, a secret oath-taking society dedicated to driving out the British authorities dismissed it as primitive superstition. They couldn't have been more wrong. The rebellion erupted in 1952 with coordinated attacks on white settlers and African collaborators. The Mau Mau weren't a conventional army. They were farmers, herders, and laborers who traded hoes for rifles. They knew the forests of the Aberdare Mountains like the backs of their hands, using the terrain to launch ambushes before vanishing into the mist. British forces, trained for open battle, found themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that refused to fight on their terms. London's response was a masterclass in brutality. Declaring a state of emergency, they unleashed a campaign of mass arrests, torture, and systematic terror. Suspects were rounded up by the tens of thousands, crammed into barbed wire camps where beatings and starvation were routine. One particularly grim invention, the dilution technique, involved forcing detainees to dig their own latrines, then making them drink the sewage as punishment. Meanwhile, aerial bombers scorched villages suspected of harboring rebels, leaving civilians to choose between betrayal or starvation. What's chilling isn't just the violence, it's the silence that followed. For decades, British archives sealed away the worst atrocities, painting the Mau Mau as savage terrorists rather than desperate freedom fighters. Survivors who dared speak out were labeled liars or troublemakers. It wasn't until 2011, after a landmark lawsuit by elderly Kenyan plaintiffs, that the UK government finally admitted to torture and agreed to pay reparations. Even then, the apology was carefully worded, avoiding any mention of systemic policy or responsibility. The Mau Mau Uprising forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Why does it take 60 years for an empire to acknowledge its crimes? How many other atrocities remain buried in classified files or dismissed as collateral damage? And perhaps most crucially, what does it mean when justice arrives so late that most of its victims are already gone? The rebellion may have been crushed, but its legacy lingers in every whispered oath, every unearthed mass grave, every faded scar, because empires don't just fall on battlefields. They crumble when the stories they tried to erase refuse to stay